The gun pressed against Katherine Morrison's temple was a Sig Sauer P226, 9mm, standard issue for law enforcement before the man holding it had turned his badge into a license for murder. She knew the model because she had watched Raymond Harris use the same weapon to kill her father 8 years ago. Now his arm locked around her throat in a hotel corridor, while FBI tactical teams shouted commands and guests screamed, and the man who had ordered her father's execution stood 20 feet away pretending not to recognize her name. But we need to go back to the night everything started. Back to when Katherine Morrison was 17 years old and still believed the system protected people who told the truth. March 14, 2016. Brooklyn, New York, 11:47 at night. Robert Morrison sat at his desk in the small accounting office he had built over 20 years of meticulous work. Certified public accountant, licensed in New York and New Jersey. Reputation for finding errors that other accountants missed. He had a gift for numbers, a photographic memory that let him spot patterns invisible to normal analysis. His daughter Katherine inherited the same genetic quirk, the same blessing and curse of remembering everything with perfect clarity. She was doing calculus homework at the corner desk while her father reviewed files for his biggest client, Delacroix Capital Management, private equity firm, $6 billion in assets, fees alone paid for Katherine's college fund and the mortgage on their modest house in Flatbush. Her mother had died from cancer 3 years earlier. Now it was just the two of them, father and daughter, accountant and apprentice. Robert had been reviewing subsidiary transactions for 3 days. Now he stopped, his hand frozen over a spreadsheet, his expression shifting from concentration to concern to something darker. Katherine looked up. "Dad, what's wrong?" He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number she had never seen him call before. When someone answered, he spoke in the careful tone of a man who understood the weight of his words. "My name is Robert Morrison. I'm a certified public accountant in Brooklyn. I'm calling to report suspected money laundering by a financial services company. I have documentation showing $31 million moving through shell companies to unknown beneficiaries over a 2-year period. The transactions violate banking secrecy laws and appear designed to conceal criminal proceeds. I'm willing to testify." The voice on the other end asked questions. Robert answered each one with dates and dollar amounts and corporate entities that Katherine's memory absorbed and preserved. Securities and Exchange Commission hotline, whistleblower complaint, federal investigation pending. When he hung up, Robert looked at his daughter with an intensity she had rarely seen. "Katie, I need you to listen carefully. If anything happens to me, if anyone ever asks you about this conversation, you tell them everything you just heard. Every word, every detail. Promise me." "Dad, you're scaring me." "Promise me." "I promise." 42 minutes later, the office door exploded inward. Katherine had moved to the storage closet by then, getting more printer paper, when she heard the glass shatter. Training from countless active shooter drills took over. She pulled the door almost shut, leaving a gap barely wide enough to see through, and pressed herself into the corner behind filing cabinets. Her heart hammered so hard she thought the men would hear it. 3 men entered. The lead man was in his 50s, athletic build despite his age, with a scar running down his left cheek like someone had tried to split his face and failed. He wore a dark jacket and moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done violence professionally. Robert Morrison stood up from his desk. "Are you from the SEC?" The scarred man smiled. "Something worse." The first gunshot was impossibly loud in the enclosed space. Katherine bit through her own lip to stop the scream building in her throat. Her father fell backward, his chair toppling, blood spreading across his white dress shirt in a pattern her photographic memory would preserve forever. 2 more shots, professional, efficient, final. Then silence, except for wet breathing that stopped after 30 seconds. The scarred man pulled out a phone. "It's done, Mr. Delacroix. The target has been neutralized. But there's a problem. He already filed a complaint with the SEC. We need to contain this." The voice on the other end was calm, educated, carrying the accent of expensive schools and inherited wealth. "Find the documentation, destroy everything, and make sure there are no other copies." "What about the complaint he already filed?" "I'll handle that separately. We have friends at the SEC. The complaint will disappear, just clean up your end." "Understood." Katherine watched them ransack her father's office. They took his computer, his external hard drives, his file cabinets, everything that contained evidence of the crimes he had discovered. They were professionals. They knew what to look for. They left nothing that could help investigators. 17 minutes after they left, Katherine Morrison crawled out of the storage closet on hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Her father lay on the floor in a pool of blood that had already started to congeal. His eyes were open. His last expression was surprise, as if he hadn't truly believed that telling the truth could get him killed. Katherine pulled out her phone, dialed 911, gave the address in a voice that didn't sound like her own. Then she sat on the floor next to her father's body and waited for the police who would fail to find his killers. The investigation lasted 2 weeks. NYPD Homicide conducted interviews, collected evidence, filed reports. A detective named Michael Chen seemed genuinely invested in solving the case. But then the investigation hit a wall. The security cameras had been disabled. The building's entry logs had been erased. The 3 men had left no fingerprints, no DNA, no trace evidence. Detective Chen called Katherine with the news. "I'm sorry, Miss Morrison. We're classifying this as a robbery homicide. No suspects at this time. The case will remain open, but without new leads, there's not much we can do." "What about my father's SEC complaint?" Katherine asked. "The one he filed the night he died." Long pause on the other end. "What complaint?" "He called the Securities and Exchange Commission. Reported money laundering by Delacroix Capital. That's why they killed him, to stop the investigation." "Miss Morrison, I checked with federal regulators. There's no record of any complaint filed by your father. No investigation. No case file." "That's impossible. I heard him make the call. I remember every word." "Maybe you misunderstood what you heard. Grief can distort memories." "I have eidetic memory, detective, photographic recall. I remember every word he said, every number, every detail. My father filed that complaint and someone made it disappear." Detective Chen's voice shifted, became careful. "Miss Morrison, I understand you're upset, but making accusations about federal agencies isn't going to help find your father's killer. My advice is to let us handle the investigation." Katherine hung up. That was when she understood. The system wasn't designed to protect people like her father. It was designed to protect people with enough money and power to make murder charges disappear. 3 days later, Katherine Morrison ceased to exist. She became Jessica Parker. Fake Social Security number purchased from a document forger in Queens. Fake employment history built through cash jobs that never appeared in databases. She left New York and drifted west, working as a waitress in Pittsburgh, a retail clerk in Columbus, a night janitor in Indianapolis, always moving, always careful, always watching for the men who might realize they had left a witness. 8 years passed. Katherine turned 25. She had survived by being invisible, by accepting that justice was a fairy tale sold to children who didn't understand how the world really worked. She lived in a studio apartment in Chicago's Rogers Park neighborhood, working the graveyard shift at a mid-size accounting firm called Hartman and Associates. Data entry clerk, $18 an hour. No questions asked about gaps in her employment history. But Katherine Morrison had never stopped investigating. Every night, after processing the invoices and financial statements that crossed her desk, she would spend hours researching Delacroix Capital Management. The company was publicly traded now, worth $8 billion, with CEO James Delacroix appearing regularly on financial news networks to discuss market trends and investment strategies. His younger brother David served as chief financial officer. Together, they had built an empire. An empire funded by the same criminal enterprise that had killed her father. Katherine knew this because her photographic memory had preserved every detail from that night. Every transaction her father had flagged, every shell company he had identified, every pattern of fraud he had documented. And over 8 years of patient research, she had watched those same patterns continue. The key was a company called Atlantic Business Services. Shell Corporation registered in Delaware. No employees, no office, no legitimate business activity. But over the past 8 years, Atlantic Business Services had received payments totaling $47 million from various Delacroix Capital subsidiaries, all marked as consulting fees, all lacking any supporting documentation. Money laundering, the same crime her father had discovered, the same crime that had gotten him killed. Katherine had compiled evidence, built files, prepared a comprehensive report showing the flow of funds through shell companies and offshore accounts. She had done everything her father had done, but she had learned from his mistake. She wouldn't file the complaint herself. She would send it anonymously to multiple federal agencies simultaneously. SEC, FBI, IRS, FinCEN. She would make sure the evidence couldn't disappear this time. But first, she needed one more piece of data. 3 nights ago, Katherine had accessed Delacroix Capital's client portal using the credentials Hartman and Associates maintained for vendor verification. It was a minor violation, barely worth noticing in the vast machinery of corporate finance. But it gave her access to internal documents that weren't available through public filings. She had found what she needed: detailed transaction records, email exchanges between executives, board meeting minutes that showed David Delacroix personally approving the payments to Atlantic Business Services, evidence that would prove the CFO's direct involvement in money laundering. Katherine downloaded nothing, printed nothing, left no trail except the access log showing her credentials had viewed the portal for 8 minutes. Then she logged out and began preparing her anonymous complaint. She did not know that 8 minutes was enough. The next day, an email appeared in her inbox from Delacroix Capital Human Resources. Subject line: Employment Verification Request. The message was brief and professional and terrifying. We are conducting a routine audit of vendor access credentials. Please confirm your authorization to access our client portal on the evening of March 13th. Katherine stared at the screen. They knew. Somehow, they knew. The careful invisibility she had maintained for 8 years was compromised by 8 minutes of searching for truth. She could run, pack a bag, drain her bank account, buy a bus ticket to somewhere new, start over with another fake identity. She had done it before. She could do it again. But her father's voice, preserved in perfect memory, asked the question she couldn't escape. How long will you keep running? Katherine Morrison made a decision. She would not run, not this time, not ever again. That evening, she left her apartment to walk to the corner store. The March air carried winter's last edge, Chicago's skyline sharp against clouds threatening snow. She had made it half a block when a woman's voice called a name Katherine hadn't used in 8 years. Katherine Morrison. She turned. The woman was in her early 40s, professional clothes under a dark overcoat, moving with the controlled confidence of someone who carried authority and wasn't afraid to use it. She held up a badge, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Special Agent Diane Reeves. Catherine's first instinct was still to run. But Agent Reeves was already close enough to intercept any attempt at flight. And something in the woman's expression suggested this wasn't an arrest. This was an opportunity. Your fingerprints from the 2016 crime scene match records in our database, Reeves said. Your social security number is fraudulent. And 2 nights ago, you accessed a corporation currently under federal investigation. We need to talk. The FBI field office in downtown Chicago occupied 3 floors of a government building designed in the brutalist style of the 1970s. All concrete and right angles and windows too small to jump through. Agent Reeves led Katherine to an interview room on the 7th floor. Coffee was offered and declined. The door closed. For several seconds, the 2 women studied each other across a metal table. Reeves spoke first. Katherine Morrison, age 17 when your father was murdered in his Brooklyn office. Disappeared shortly after NYPD closed the investigation as unsolved. No employment history, no credit cards, no digital footprint under your real name for 8 years. Until 6 months ago, when we reopened the investigation into Robert Morrison's death. Katherine kept her voice flat. Why reopen it now? Because we received intelligence about Delacroix Capital's money laundering operation. When we started analyzing their financial structure, we found references to an SEC complaint filed in 2016 by a Robert Morrison, certified public accountant. That complaint was buried within 24 hours. Your father was killed the same night he filed it. That pattern suggests the Bureau should take another look. Reeves slid a folder across the table. Inside were crime scene photographs that Katherine had tried for 8 years to forget, but that her photographic memory preserved with cruel precision. Her father on the floor, blood pooling under his body. The ransacked office. We've been building a case against Delacroix Capital for 18 months, Reeves continued. RICO violations, conspiracy, murder for hire. But building a case isn't the same as proving it in court. We need witnesses. Specifically, we need someone who understands complex financial crimes and can analyze evidence in real time. Someone like you. Katherine looked at the photographs, then at the agent. You want me to testify about what happened 8 years ago. One witness statement won't convict anyone. We don't just want you to testify about the past. We want you to help us build evidence for the present. Delacroix Capital is hosting an investor summit in Chicago in 4 days. James Delacroix will be there. So will his brother David. We have authorization to surveil the event, but surveillance only gets us so far. We need someone on the inside who can spot financial irregularities, identify criminal activity, provide expert analysis. Katherine understood what was being asked. You want me to go undercover? We want you to do what your father tried to do. Expose the truth. Except this time, the FBI protects you instead of letting you get killed. The offer hung between them. 8 years of hiding had taught Katherine to be suspicious of systems and promises, and anyone who claimed they could keep her safe. But 8 years of hiding had also taught her that invisibility was its own kind of prison. She had survived, but survival wasn't the same as living. If I help you, I need guarantees. Full immunity for the identity fraud, witness protection after any trial, and you investigate everyone, not just David Delacroix. If his brother James knew about the money laundering, he gets charged too. Reeves hesitated. Our intelligence suggests James Delacroix might not know about his brother's criminal activities. David appears to be running the operation independently. Then investigate thoroughly. Because being the CEO doesn't excuse negligence. If James Delacroix signed off on financial statements that should have revealed the fraud, he's complicit whether he claims ignorance or not. Agreed, but you follow Bureau protocols. No confronting suspects. No independent action. You observe, you analyze, you report to your handler. We make the arrests. Deal. Reeves pulled out another file, this one with red classification markings. We intercepted encrypted communications between David Delacroix and a man identified as Raymond Harris, former NYPD captain, retired 3 years ago, currently works as head of security for David Delacroix's division of the company. Catherine's pulse accelerated. Harris, the scarred man from her father's office. We believe Harris was the triggerman in your father's murder. The communications we intercepted suggest he's planning another hit at the investor summit against James Delacroix. David is planning to kill his own brother. That's our assessment. The messages reference neutralizing an asset, making it look accidental. The timeline matches the summit. If we're right, James Delacroix will be dead within the week. Katherine processed this. So you want me to help you save the CEO of the company that killed my father? We want to catch everyone involved in a criminal conspiracy that includes murder. If James Delacroix is a victim rather than a perpetrator, we protect him. If the investigation reveals he was complicit in your father's death, we prosecute him. Either way, we take down the operation. And what about me, after this is over? Witness protection if you want it. New identity, new city, federal marshals keeping you safe. Or you testify and go back to your life. Your choice. Katherine thought about the studio apartment in Rogers Park. The fake social security number. The graveyard shifts processing other people's invoices. 8 years of hiding had given her safety but stolen her future. Maybe it was time to take it back. I'm in, she said. Tell me what you need me to do. The next 3 days moved with the compressed urgency of a military operation. FBI technical teams provided Katherine with training on covert recording devices, signal interceptors, and encrypted communications. She learned how to spot surveillance, how to create dead drops, how to extract herself from dangerous situations. Her handler was a young agent named Marcus Webb, who had started his career in financial crimes and still remembered the technical details. You'll be operating under light cover, Webb explained. Hotel hospitality staff. It gives you access to the private floors without raising suspicion. You wear an earpiece so we can maintain communication. You carry a panic button disguised as a room key, and you remember that your job is intelligence gathering, not law enforcement. If things go wrong, you get out. What if I can identify David Delacroix or Raymond Harris in the act of planning the murder? Then you signal us and we move in, but you don't confront them yourself. Understood. Understood. The day of the summit arrived with unseasonable warmth, March pretending to be April, the sky over Chicago clear and bright. Katherine dressed in the dark uniform of Marriott hospitality staff, her credentials provided by the FBI and verified through channels she didn't ask about. She took the red line downtown, walked the last 3 blocks to the hotel, and entered through the service entrance like she had worked there for years. The investor summit occupied the entire 28th floor. Delacroix Capital had booked every room, every conference space, every inch of high-priced real estate. Security was tight. Private guards at every elevator bank, metal detectors at the floor entrance, and James Delacroix's personal protection detail, 8 men in dark suits moving in coordinated patterns around their principal. Katherine's job was to monitor the service corridors, while FBI technical teams tracked the attendees through surveillance cameras. She pushed a cleaning cart through empty hallways, her earpiece carrying the low chatter of agents coordinating their coverage. Then she saw him. Raymond Harris stood near the service elevator with another guard, both of them positioned away from the main security detail. While the other guards maintained visual contact with James Delacroix, Harris and his partner kept checking their phones. Every few minutes, the devices would vibrate simultaneously, and both men would angle away to read messages they clearly didn't want others to see. Katherine had seen this pattern before. In her father's office, in the moments before the door had exploded inward. Coordination, timing, making sure every element was in place before executing the plan. She activated her earpiece. Agent Reeves, I have eyes on Raymond Harris. He's exhibiting pre-operational behavior, coordinating with someone via text message. Can you intercept the communications? Katherine pulled out the signal interceptor the FBI had provided, a device small enough to hide in her palm. She moved closer to Harris's position, pretending to check supplies in a storage closet. The device began capturing local cellular traffic. Her phone's screen filled with intercepted messages. 15:30 hours. Parking garage level B3. Brake line already compromised. Confirm target departure time. The response came quickly. 15:30 confirmed. Target will take vehicle per usual protocol. Make it clean. Katherine's blood went cold. They're planning a car accident. James Delacroix is scheduled to leave at 3:30. They've sabotaged his vehicle. Reeves' voice carried new tension. Can you verify which vehicle? Katherine accessed the hotel's internal system using credentials the FBI had provided. James Delacroix had reserved a black Escalade for airport transport at 15:30 hours. Vehicle currently in parking garage level B3. We need to warn him, Katherine said. If he gets in that car, he's dead. If we warn him officially, we blow the operation. David and Harris will know we're onto them. They'll scatter. Then what do we do? Reeves was silent for 3 seconds, an eternity in operational time. Then get to James Delacroix. Warn him directly. We'll move in as soon as you make contact. That's not the protocol. I'm supposed to observe, not engage. Protocol just changed. We're not letting a man die to preserve an investigation. Move now. Katherine abandoned the cleaning cart and walked directly toward the main corridor where James Delacroix was conducting meetings with potential investors. Security immediately noticed her presence. 2 guards moved to intercept. She didn't slow down. Mr. Delacroix, I need 30 seconds. Your life depends on it. The guards closed in, hands moving toward concealed weapons. But James Delacroix held up one hand, stopping them. He was 42 years old tall, with silver threading through dark hair, and eyes that assessed people the way other men assessed balance sheets. He looked at Katherine with the focused attention of someone who had built a fortune by recognizing valuable information. Who are you? Someone who knows your brother hired Raymond Harris to kill you at 15:30 today. Parking garage level B3. Brake line sabotage on your Escalade. The corridor went silent. James Delacroix's expression didn't change, but Katherine saw his pupils dilate slightly. Fear response. He was processing the threat, calculating probabilities, deciding whether to trust a stranger in a hospitality uniform. Before he could respond, Raymond Harris drew his weapon. Everyone down. The command came with absolute authority, the voice of a man who had spent decades giving orders and expecting obedience. Harris's guns swept across the corridor, targeting the other security guards. Nobody move or people die. Chaos erupted. Investors screamed and dropped to the floor. Security guards froze, caught between training that said protect the principle and survival instinct that said don't get shot. James Delacroix remained standing, his eyes locked on the man who had been part of his security detail for 3 years. Ray, what are you doing? Following orders. Harris moved toward Katherine, his weapon now targeting her specifically. How do you know about the brake lines? Katherine's training from Agent Webb came back. Stay calm. Don't escalate. Buy time for backup. I'm with the FBI. This building is surrounded. You're already finished. Harris laughed without humor. The FBI, of course, should have known when we picked up unusual surveillance patterns. He grabbed Katherine, arm locking around her throat, gun pressed against her temple. That's when she recognized the specific model. Sig Sauer P226, the same weapon he had used to kill her father. "I walk out of here, or she dies," Harris announced to the corridor. "Tell your FBI friends to clear a path." Katherine felt the cold metal against her skin and remembered being 17 years old, hiding in a closet, watching this same man murder her father. The memory brought clarity instead of fear. She knew exactly who Raymond Harris was, knew his methods, knew his weaknesses. "You're Raymond Harris," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Former NYPD captain. You killed Robert Morrison in Brooklyn on March 14, 2016. Shot him 3 times on orders from David Delacroix. The FBI has ballistics evidence. Bank records showing $500,000 transferred to offshore accounts in your name. Recorded phone calls. You're facing life in prison for murder for hire." Harris's grip tightened. "Who are you?" "I'm the girl who was hiding in the storage closet. The witness you didn't check for. The one who's going to watch you die in a federal prison." The corridor doors exploded inward. FBI tactical teams in full gear, weapons raised, laser sights painting red dots across Harris's chest. Agent Reeves stood at the front of the formation, her voice amplified through a handheld speaker. "Raymond Harris, you are under arrest for murder, conspiracy, and violation of federal RICO statutes. Release the hostage and get on the ground." For a long moment, nothing moved except the red laser dots tracking across Harris's body. Katherine could feel his breathing change, could sense him calculating odds, could almost hear the thoughts running through his mind. He was a professional. He knew when the situation was unrecoverable. The gun dropped away from Katherine's head. Harris released her and raised his hands. "I want a lawyer." The arrest happened with practiced efficiency. Harris on the ground, hands secured, rights delivered in the mechanical cadence of federal agents who had made thousands of arrests. Katherine stepped back, her legs suddenly unsteady, her body finally catching up with what her mind had already processed. Agent Reeves approached. "You did good. Exactly what you needed to do." "I broke protocol. You said observe only." "I also said we weren't letting a man die. You made the right call." James Delacroix stood nearby, surrounded by his remaining security team, watching his head of security get loaded into a federal transport vehicle. When Harris was gone, he turned to Katherine. "You saved my life. I don't even know your name." "Katherine Morrison. My father was Robert Morrison. Your company's CFO had him killed 8 years ago." James Delacroix's expression shifted, recognition and something darker moving behind his eyes. "I need to speak with you, privately." The FBI's mobile command center was a modified van parked 2 blocks from the hotel, filled with communications equipment and tactical displays showing every angle of the arrest operation. Agent Reeves brought both Katherine and James Delacroix here, away from the chaos of the hotel, into a space where truth could be extracted without the performance of public spaces. Reeves laid out photographs on the small table. Robert Morrison, certified public accountant, murdered in his Brooklyn office on March 14, 2016. He had filed an SEC complaint hours before his death, alleging money laundering by Delacroix Capital Management. That complaint was buried. Morrison was killed. The case went cold, until now. She showed James Delacroix the intercepted communications between his brother David and Raymond Harris. The financial records showing $47 million moving through shell companies. The evidence that had taken 18 months to compile. "Your brother has been running a criminal enterprise through your company's subsidiary structure. Money laundering for cybercrime organizations. When Robert Morrison discovered the scheme, David ordered his execution. When you got close to discovering the same information, David planned to kill you too. James Delacroix looked at each piece of evidence with the methodical focus of someone trained to evaluate data. But Katherine watched his hands. They were shaking slightly. He was either a victim processing betrayal or a co-conspirator performing innocence. She couldn't tell which yet. "I didn't know," James said quietly. "David handled all financial operations. I focused on investor relations and acquisitions. If there were irregularities in the subsidiary accounts, he was supposed to report them to me." "Supposed to," Katherine said, "but you signed the annual financial statements. You approved the budgets. You're the CEO. Claiming you didn't know is claiming you didn't do your job." James met her eyes. "You're right. I was negligent. I trusted my brother without verifying his work. I prioritized growth over oversight, and your father died because of my failures." The admission surprised Katherine. She had expected defensiveness, denial, the reflexive self-protection of wealthy men caught in criminal conspiracies. But James Delacroix seemed genuinely shaken by the revelation that his trust had enabled murder. Agent Reeves pulled out a legal document. "Here's your situation, Mr. Delacroix. We have enough evidence to charge you with conspiracy, even if you claim ignorance. Or you can cooperate fully. Give us access to every document, every account, every communication. Testify against your brother. Help us dismantle the entire operation." "And if I cooperate?" "Depends on what the investigation reveals. If you genuinely didn't know about the criminal activity, possible immunity. If you should have known, reduced charges. Either way, Delacroix Capital gets seized under asset forfeiture." Katherine watched James process the choice. Cooperation meant losing everything he had built, but resistance meant prison. It wasn't really a choice at all. "I'll cooperate," James said. "Full access, complete testimony. But I want to be there when you arrest David. I want to hear him admit what he did." Agent Reeves nodded. "We can arrange that." The arrest operation moved with military precision. FBI teams hit 5 locations simultaneously. Delacroix Capital's Manhattan headquarters, David Delacroix's penthouse apartment, 3 offshore banking facilities where money was being laundered. The coordination involved 70 agents across 4 states and required approval from the Deputy Attorney General. But David Delacroix had his own warning system. Katherine was in the FBI command center when the alert came through. "Target is mobile. Heading toward Teterboro Airport. Private jet fueled and ready for departure." Agent Reeves made the call. "All units pursue. I want that aircraft grounded before he's airborne." The chase played out across secure radio channels. FBI vehicles racing through New Jersey traffic. Aviation authorities scrambling to delay takeoff clearance. David Delacroix's private jet already on the tarmac, engines warming, door closing. "He's boarding," came the report. "Wheels up in 5 minutes." Katherine looked at the digital map showing the aircraft's position. If David made it into international airspace, if he reached a country without extradition treaties, justice would fail again the same way it had failed her father. The system would protect the guilty and abandon the victims. She pulled out her laptop and access systems the FBI hadn't authorized her to use. Financial networks, banking protocols, the same tools she had spent 8 years learning in preparation for this moment. "What are you doing?" Agent Reeves demanded. "Stopping him." Katherine's fingers moved across the keyboard with the speed of someone who had practiced this operation in her mind 1,000 times. She accessed David Delacroix's offshore accounts using credentials she had extracted from the Delacroix Capital portal days earlier. Then she did something that was technically illegal but morally necessary. She froze every account. contacted the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network with evidence of money laundering. Triggered asset seizure protocols in 3 countries simultaneously. David Delacroix's phone would be showing error messages right now. Transfer failed. Accounts frozen. $50 million in escape money suddenly inaccessible. The radio crackled. Target is exiting the aircraft. Repeat, target has abandoned departure. He's on the tarmac. FBI tactical teams surrounded David Delacroix within 30 seconds. He stood next to his private jet with his hands raised, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion to rage as he realized what had happened. His phone call to James came through the FBI's wiretap. "Brother," he said, "tell them to back off. We can work this out. Family first." James Delacroix was listening from the command center, standing next to Katherine and Agent Reeves. His response was quiet but clear. "You killed an innocent man. You tried to kill me. We're not family anymore." David's voice turned cold. "Then I'll take everyone down with me. I have documents proving you knew about the money laundering. Signed approvals with your name. You're as guilty as I am." He held up a tablet, showing it to the FBI cameras. Email from James Delacroix, dated 2019. "David, handle the Atlantic transactions discreetly. I don't want IRS questions." Katherine looked at the screen, her photographic memory analyzing the metadata. The timestamps don't match. That email is fabricated. Look at the header information. It was created last week, not in 2019. Agent Reeves spoke into her radio. "Suspect is attempting document fraud. Disregard any evidence he presents. Move in for arrest." David Delacroix realized his last bluff had failed. He pulled a gun from his jacket, pressed it against his own temple. "You want me? Come get me." The FBI sniper was faster. A single shot struck the weapon, sending it spinning from David's hand. He screamed, clutching his wrist, and then tactical agents swarmed him. The arrest was over in seconds. Katherine watched through the video feed as David Delacroix was forced to the ground, handcuffed, read his rights. The man who had ordered her father's murder. The man who had built a criminal empire through fraud and violence. The man who would spend the rest of his life in a federal prison. Agent Reeves turned to Katherine. "We got him. Your father's killer is in custody." Katherine nodded but felt nothing. No satisfaction, no relief, just exhaustion that reached down to her bones. Harris pulled the trigger. David gave the order. But the system that was supposed to prevent this, the regulators and law enforcement and corporate oversight, they all failed. "My father died because good people trusted that the system would work." "This time it did work," Reeves said, "because you made it work." "Maybe, or maybe I just got lucky." James Delacroix approached them, his expression uncertain. "Miss Morrison, Katherine, I know nothing I say can change what happened to your father, but I want you to know that I will spend the rest of my life trying to make this right." Katherine looked at the man who had unknowingly enabled her father's murder through negligence and misplaced trust. "You're going to lose everything. Your company, your wealth, your reputation. Is that enough?" "No, but it's a start." James paused. "What will you do now?" "Testify. Make sure your brother and Raymond Harris spend their lives in prison." And then, Katherine surprised herself with the answer, "Maybe I'll finish college. Get my CPA license like my father. Become the kind of accountant who catches people like David before they kill anyone." "Your father would be proud." "My father is dead." Katherine's voice was flat. Being proud doesn't resurrect the murdered, but maybe preventing future murders is enough. They stood in silence as the tactical teams began packing up their equipment, as the private aviation terminal returned to its sterile normality, as the machinery of federal prosecution began grinding toward justice. Katherine felt exhausted in a way that sleep could never fix. She had spent 8 years hiding, 8 years investigating, 8 years waiting for this moment. And now that it had arrived, she felt only emptiness. Agent Reeves approached. "Katherine, we need you to come to the field office. Formal statement, evidence review, witness preparation. This is going to be a long process." "How long?" "Months, maybe years. David's lawyers will fight every charge. James's cooperation will be negotiated carefully. And we still need to identify everyone else involved in the conspiracy. You're going to be key to all of it." Katherine looked up at the New Jersey sky, evening settling over the industrial landscape surrounding the airport. 8 years ago, she had stood in her father's office and watched him die. 8 years ago, the system had failed to protect him. 8 years ago, she had become invisible to survive. Now she was about to become the most visible person in a federal prosecution that would dominate headlines and destroy lives and maybe, possibly, achieve something that looked like justice. She thought of her father's last words, preserved in perfect memory. "Katie, promise me." She thought of the 8 years she had lost. She thought of the choice she had made to stop hiding and start fighting. "I'm ready," she told Reeves. "Let's finish this." The FBI field office never really slept. Even at 3 in the morning, agents moved through corridors with the focused energy of people accustomed to crisis. Reeves led Katherine to a conference room where other investigators had already assembled evidence, covering the walls with printouts and photographs and timeline charts that mapped out David's criminal enterprise. Katherine sat at the table and began walking them through everything she knew. Her photographic memory gave her an advantage that traditional witnesses lacked. She could recall exact dollar amounts, specific transaction dates, precise language from documents she had glimpsed for seconds. The FBI agents took notes with increasing amazement. "How do you remember all this?" one of them asked. "Genetic trait, eidetic memory. My father had it too. He could spot financial irregularities that other accountants missed because he remembered every number he had ever seen. It made him very good at his job. It also got him killed." The questioning continued for hours. Katherine described her infiltration of Hartman and Associates, her access to the Delacroix client portal, the patterns she had identified in the money laundering scheme. She described the night of her father's murder with clinical precision, knowing that every detail would be scrutinized by defense attorneys looking for inconsistencies. When she reached the part about hiding in the closet, about watching Raymond Harris kill her father, her voice finally wavered. Reeves called for a break. "You're doing great," the agent said. "I know this is hard." Hard doesn't begin to describe it. Katherine accepted a bottle of water, drank half of it without tasting. "For 8 years, I've been running from this memory. Now I have to weaponize it, turn my trauma into testimony. Convince a jury that what I saw in that closet is reliable despite being traumatized and 17 and hidden behind filing cabinets. Your memory is reliable. We've verified every detail you've provided against physical evidence. Defense attorneys will try to shake you, but the facts support your account." "Facts," Katherine laughed without humor. "My father believed in facts. Believed that if you presented the truth clearly enough, the system would respond appropriately. Look where that got him. But the system is responding now. Because of you, because you didn't give up." "I gave up for 8 years. I hid. I changed my name. I pretended my father's murder didn't matter as long as I stayed invisible." "You survived. That's not giving up. That's strategic retreat, and now you're fighting back." Katherine wasn't sure she believed that, but she appreciated the attempt at validation. She returned to the questioning, walking the FBI team through the technical details of shell company structures and offshore banking protocols. Her knowledge surprised them. She explained that she had spent 8 years educating herself, taking online courses in forensic accounting, studying the same techniques criminals use to hide money. I needed to understand how they did it, she said. Needed to know the system well enough to beat it. My father went into that fight unprepared, trusting that his honesty would protect him. I wasn't going to make the same mistake. As dawn broke over Chicago, Reeves finally called an end to the interview. We have enough for now. You should get some rest. Rest, Katherine considered the word. When was the last time she had slept without nightmares? When was the last time she had felt safe enough to let her guard down? 8 years ago, the night before her father died. Reeves seemed to read her thoughts. We can arrange protective custody. Safe house, security detail, everything you need. No, I've been in hiding long enough. If David's people want to come after me, let them try. I'm done running. David's people are in custody or scattered. You're safer now than you've been in 8 years. Am I? Katherine gathered her belongings. David had connections to international criminal networks, money launderers, cybercriminals, people who might see value in eliminating the witness who took him down. I'm not naive enough to think this is over just because you have him in handcuffs. That's why we're offering protection. And I'm declining it. Katherine stood. I appreciate everything the FBI has done, but I need to do this on my terms. I need to stop being a victim and start being a person who happens to have survived victimization. There's a difference. Reeves walked her to the elevator. What will you do now? Katherine considered the question. The sun was rising outside, painting Chicago's skyline in shades of orange and gold. Somewhere in this city, people were waking up to normal lives, unaware that a major criminal conspiracy had just been dismantled in their midst. Somewhere, her father's grave sat in Brooklyn, waiting for a visit she had been avoiding for 8 years. Somewhere, the future waited with its infinite possibilities. I'm going to finish my degree in forensic accounting. Going to become the kind of expert who can prevent what happened to my father. And I'm going to testify at David's trial. Put him away for the rest of his life. Good, Reeves extended her hand. Thank you, Katherine, for your courage, for your testimony, for everything. Katherine shook the offered hand, feeling the firm grip of someone who had dedicated her career to pursuing justice. Don't thank me yet. Thank me when David and Harris are convicted. When James faces consequences for his negligence. When the system actually works the way it's supposed to. She left the FBI building and walked into the morning light, anonymous again among the early commuters, carrying secrets that would reshape lives and destroy fortunes. She had spent 8 years invisible. Now, she was about to become the most important witness in a federal prosecution that would test everything she believed about justice and accountability, and whether the system could ever truly protect those who dared to speak truth. Her father had died believing that exposing corruption was worth any cost. Katherine was about to discover if he had been right. The weeks that followed existed in a strange suspension between her old life and whatever came next. Katherine returned to her studio apartment in Rogers Park, but it no longer felt like a sanctuary. The FBI had swept it for surveillance devices and found nothing, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She quit her job at Hartman and Associates, citing personal reasons, and the firm accepted her resignation without question. They had no idea that their former employee had just helped dismantle one of their largest clients. She enrolled at Northwestern University for the fall semester, her real identity now restored in official records. The registrar's office processed her application with bureaucratic indifference, unaware that Katherine Morrison had been legally dead for 8 years. Her transcripts from before the disappearance were retrieved. Her acceptance was confirmed. She would begin her master's program in forensic accounting in September. But first, she had to face something she had been avoiding for 8 years. On a Saturday morning in June, Katherine took the train to New York. The cemetery in Brooklyn was exactly as she remembered it. Quiet, green, filled with stones marking lives reduced to dates and brief epitaphs. She found her father's grave in the section where they had buried him 8 years ago. The headstone was simple granite. Robert Morrison, beloved father, honest accountant, the dates of his birth and death, nothing that captured who he had been or what he had meant or why he had died. Katherine knelt and placed flowers against the stone. Then she spoke for the first time to a father who couldn't answer. "Dad, I got them. The people who killed you. David Delacroix is in federal custody. Raymond Harris, too. They're both going to prison for the rest of their lives. I made sure of it." The stone offered no response. Katherine continued anyway. "I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry I hid for 8 years instead of fighting back immediately. But I needed to survive first. Needed to be strong enough to face them. And now I am." She traced the letters of his name with one finger. "I'm going back to school, getting my master's in forensic accounting, just like you always wanted. I'm going to be the kind of accountant who catches criminals before they kill anyone. I'm going to make sure your death meant something." Tears came then, the first she had allowed herself since the day of his funeral. They fell onto the grass and disappeared into the earth. "I miss you, every day. I think about the conversations we'll never have, the advice you can't give me, the life we could have had if they hadn't taken you away." She stayed for an hour, saying everything she had needed to say for 8 years. Then she stood, wiped her eyes, and walked back to the subway. Her father was gone. That would never change. But his death would not be meaningless. Katherine would make sure of that. She had work to do, a trial to prepare for, a future to build from the wreckage of the past. And somewhere, in a federal prison, David Delacroix was learning that wealth couldn't insulate him from justice forever. Katherine Morrison was done being invisible, done running, done letting criminals believe they were untouchable. The ledger never lied. Her father had taught her that. Now she would prove it in court, would use her photographic memory to destroy the defense's case, would show a jury that truth mattered more than money, that justice could prevail over corruption, that one honest accountant's death could change the system. It wouldn't bring her father back, but it would honor his memory. And that was the only kind of resurrection available to the dead. Katherine Morrison walked out of that cemetery with her shoulders back and her head high, ready to face whatever came next. Ready to testify, ready to fight, ready to make sure that her father's belief in the power of truth hadn't died with him. The trial would come, the verdict would come, and Katherine would be there for all of it, speaking for a father who could no longer speak for himself. That was justice, imperfect, incomplete, but real. And it would have to be enough. The trial that would define Katherine Morrison's life began on a Monday morning in January 2025, when the temperature in Manhattan dropped to 14 degrees, and the federal courthouse at 500 Pearl Street became an arena where justice and wealth collided with the force of continents shifting. 10 months had passed since the arrests. 10 months of grand jury proceedings and plea negotiations and legal maneuvering that reduced human tragedy to procedural chess. Katherine had spent those months in a strange limbo between her old life as a ghost and her new existence as the government's star witness. She attended classes at Northwestern 3 days a week, flew to New York for prosecutor meetings the other 4, and tried to build something resembling normalcy from the wreckage of 8 years spent hiding. But normal was a luxury reserved for people whose fathers hadn't been murdered by corporate criminals. Assistant United States Attorney Rebecca Wong met Katherine in a conference room on the 18th floor of the federal building at 7:30 in the morning. Huang was 38 years old, Harvard Law School, daughter of Taiwanese immigrants who had built a restaurant empire in Los Angeles through the same work ethic their daughter brought to prosecuting financial crimes. She had a conviction rate of 94% and a reputation for destroying defense attorneys who underestimated her. The jury selection took 3 days. Huang used her peremptory challenges to exclude anyone with connections to the financial services industry, anyone who had expressed skepticism about corporate prosecutions on their social media profiles, anyone whose body language suggested they believed wealth equaled innocence. The defense attorney, Jonathan Green, tried to exclude minorities, women under 40, and anyone who looked like they might sympathize with whistleblowers. They settled on 12 jurors who would decide if David Delacroix deserved to spend his life in prison. 8 women, 4 men. A retired high school teacher, an engineer from Con Edison, a social worker, a construction foreman, a nurse, a librarian, 2 accountants, which Huang saw as an advantage and Green saw as a disaster he couldn't prevent. Average Americans who would be asked to understand complex financial crimes and decide if the evidence proved murder beyond reasonable doubt. Katherine sat in the gallery during jury selection, studying each potential juror the way her father had taught her to study financial statements. Look for inconsistencies. Watch for patterns. Trust your instincts when something doesn't add up. Juror number 7, a man in his 50s who claimed to have no opinion about corporate crime, kept glancing at David Delacroix with something that looked like admiration. Huang struck him. Juror number 12, a woman who worked in banking, seemed uncomfortable every time Huang mentioned money laundering. Green kept her, probably hoping for jury nullification. The final panel looked fair. That was the best anyone could hope for in a system designed to balance competing interests rather than deliver perfect justice. Opening statements began on Thursday morning. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal observers, and curiosity seekers who wanted to witness the trial of a man whose company had dominated financial news for years. David Delacroix sat at the defense table in a tailored suit that probably cost more than Katherine earned in 6 months of teaching. He looked composed, confident, like a man who believed expensive lawyers could insulate him from consequences. Rebecca Huang stood and approached the jury box. She wore a navy suit, minimal jewelry, her expression serious but not aggressive. She wanted the jury to see her as their advocate, not a zealot pursuing vengeance. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about murder disguised as business. On March 14, 2016, Robert Morrison, a certified public accountant, was shot 3 times in his Brooklyn office. The killer was Raymond Harris, a former NYPD captain. But the person who ordered that murder, who paid $500,000 to make sure Robert Morrison never testified about financial crimes, sits right there. She pointed at David Delacroix. He didn't flinch. Huang continued, walking the jury through the evidence they would see over the coming weeks. Shell companies designed to hide money, offshore accounts that violated banking laws, a conspiracy that stretched across years and continents. And at the center of it all, a man who believed his wealth and position made him untouchable. Robert Morrison discovered this conspiracy. He did exactly what the law requires. He filed a complaint with the Securities and Exchange Commission. He documented the crimes. He prepared to testify. And for doing his duty as a citizen, he was executed in front of his 17-year-old daughter. Katherine felt the jury's eyes shift to her. Huang had prepared her for this, the moment when she would become real to them, when she would stop being an abstract witness and become a daughter who had watched her father die. You will hear from Katherine Morrison. You will learn about her photographic memory, her ability to recall every detail from that night with perfect clarity. You will see the evidence she preserved through 8 years of hiding from the people who wanted her dead too. And you will conclude, as we have, that David Delacroix is guilty of murder for hire, conspiracy, money laundering, and racketeering. Thank you. Huang sat down. Jonathan Green stood up. Green was 62, silver-haired, with the kind of voice that made juries forget they were being manipulated. He had defended 3 senators, 2 Fortune 500 CEOs, and a Colombian drug lord who walked free after Green convinced a jury that the DEA had violated his client's constitutional rights. He specialized in making guilty people seem sympathetic. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just heard a story. A compelling story about murder and conspiracy and corporate crime. But that's all it is. A story. The prosecution wants you to believe that my client, a Harvard-educated businessman with no criminal record, suddenly decided to become a murderer. Why? Because an accountant discovered some irregularities in subsidiary accounts. He shook his head, his expression suggesting the absurdity of the accusation. The evidence will show that any financial irregularities at Delacroix Capital originated with David's older brother, James. James was the CEO. James had final authority over all corporate decisions. James signed the financial statements. And when federal investigators came knocking, what did James do? He cut a deal to blame his younger brother and save himself. Green walked to the defense table and placed a hand on David's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that Katherine wanted to vomit watching. David Delacroix is not a murderer. He's a scapegoat, a brilliant CFO who trusted his brother to maintain ethical corporate governance, only to discover that James had been using the company for criminal purposes. The prosecution's case relies on circumstantial evidence, questionable witness testimony, and the word of Raymond Harris, a corrupt ex-cop who will say anything to avoid the death penalty. We will show you the truth, and the truth will set David Delacroix free. Thank you. The trial moved into its evidentiary phase. Huang called witnesses in careful sequence, building her case brick by brick. FBI agents testified about the investigation, the surveillance, the intercepted communications. Forensic accountants explained how shell companies worked, how money moved through offshore accounts, how the transactions violated federal banking laws. On day 6, Huang called her star financial expert. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, professor of forensic accounting at Columbia University, had spent 30 years analyzing corporate fraud. She had testified in 73 trials and never been successfully impeached on cross-examination. She took the stand with the confidence of someone who knew her expertise was unassailable. Huang displayed a chart showing the flow of funds through Atlantic Business Services and other shell companies. Dr. Rodriguez, can you explain to the jury what this diagram represents? Rodriguez adjusted her glasses and studied the chart. This shows a classic money laundering structure. Funds from unknown sources are injected into seemingly legitimate companies. Those companies then make payments to other shell entities, layering the transactions to obscure the original source. Finally, the money emerges in accounts controlled by the scheme's architects, appearing as legitimate business income. And in your expert opinion, were these transactions legitimate business activities? No, there's no evidence of actual services rendered, no contracts, no deliverables, no legitimate business purpose. These were fraudulent transactions designed to launder money and evade taxes. Green's cross-examination tried to suggest that Dr. Rodriguez couldn't prove the transactions were criminal without knowing the identity of the original funding sources. She calmly explained that money laundering was illegal regardless of whether the underlying funds came from drug cartels or insider trading. The jury nodded along. Green sat down having accomplished nothing. Katherine testified on day 9. She had spent the previous evening with Rebecca Huang rehearsing answers, preparing for the emotional minefield of describing her father's murder in open court. But rehearsal couldn't capture the reality of sitting in the witness box with David Delacroix 15 feet away, his eyes tracking her with cold calculation. The bailiff swore her in. She raised her right hand and promised to tell the truth. Then she sat and looked at the jury. 8 women and 4 men who would decide if her father's death mattered enough to convict. State your name for the record. Katherine Morrison. Huang approached with a gentle expression designed to put witnesses at ease. Miss Morrison, what was your relationship to Robert Morrison? He was my father. And on the evening of March 14th, 2016, where were you? In my father's office in Brooklyn. I was doing calculus homework while he worked. What was your father working on that evening? He was reviewing financial documents for his client, Delacroix Capital Management. He had found discrepancies in their subsidiary accounts, evidence of money laundering. What did your father do after discovering these discrepancies? Katherine's voice remained steady despite the memories flooding back with photographic clarity. He called the Securities and Exchange Commission whistleblower hotline. He reported suspected money laundering involving $31 million. He said he was willing to testify. And what happened after he made that call? 42 minutes later, 3 men broke into his office. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Katherine continued, her eidetic memory providing details that defense attorneys couldn't shake. The model of gun, the scar on Raymond Harris's face, the exact words spoken before her father was shot, the phone call to David Delacroix confirming the execution had been completed. Miss Morrison, you were 17 years old when this happened. You were hiding in a storage closet during a traumatic event. How can you be certain about these details 9 years later? I have eidetic memory, photographic recall. It's a genetic condition I inherited from my father. I remember everything I see and hear with perfect accuracy. I can recite entire textbooks after reading them once. I can recall conversations word for word years after they happened. I wish I could forget that night, but I can't. So I'm using my memory to make sure my father's killers face justice. Huang showed Katherine photographs from the crime scene. Are you able to look at these? Katherine forced herself to study the images. Her father's body, the blood, the ransacked office. Yes, I can look at them. I've been looking at them in my memory for 9 years. Did you see Raymond Harris shoot your father? Yes. Did you hear Harris make a phone call after the shooting? Yes, he said it's done, Mr. Delacroix. The target has been neutralized. And whose voice did you hear on the other end of that call? Katherine looked directly at David Delacroix. His voice. I heard it again during FBI surveillance recordings. It's the same voice. David Delacroix ordered my father's execution. Jonathan Green's cross-examination was aggressive and calculated. He spent 3 hours trying to break Katherine's testimony, suggesting her memory had been corrupted by trauma, by grief, by FBI coaching. She remained calm, answering each question with specific details that couldn't be shaken. Miss Morrison, you claim to have eidetic memory. Can you prove that? I can recite the first 5 pages of the United States tax code verbatim if you'd like. Or I can tell you exactly what you were wearing during jury selection on Tuesday, including the fact that you had a coffee stain on your left cuff that you tried to hide with your watch. Green glanced at his watch instinctively. The jury noticed. Several smiled. You've spent 8 years living under a false identity. Doesn't that make you a criminal too? I committed identity fraud to survive. The people who killed my father had the resources to find me if I used my real name. I chose survival over legal compliance. I'm not proud of it, but I'm alive because of it. And now you're cooperating with the FBI in exchange for immunity. Doesn't that make you biased? My father is dead. I'm biased toward seeing his killers convicted. If that makes me unreliable in your eyes, I can't change that. But my memory is accurate regardless of my bias. Green tried several more angles of attack. Katherine deflected each one with the calm precision of someone who had spent 8 years preparing for this moment. After 3 hours, he gave up. No further questions. The trial continued for 4 more weeks. The prosecution called 63 witnesses, FBI agents, financial experts, corporate employees who testified about David Delacroix's control over the subsidiary accounts, and finally, the witness who would either guarantee conviction or provide grounds for appeal. Raymond Harris. He had been held in federal custody since his arrest, isolated from other prisoners for his own protection. Former cops didn't fare well in general population. He walked into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit and leg shackles, his hands cuffed in front of him. The scar on his face looked more pronounced under the harsh courtroom lighting. Harris had accepted a plea agreement. 25 years in federal prison instead of the death penalty in exchange for truthful testimony against David Delacroix. Huang had extracted every detail from him during preparation sessions, knowing that defense attorneys would attack his credibility as a convicted murderer trying to reduce his sentence. Harris took the stand and swore to tell the truth. Then he looked at the jury with the dead eyes of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Mr. Harris," Huang began, "did you kill Robert Morrison on March 14, 2016? "Yes." "Who paid you to kill him?" Harris pointed at David Delacroix. "Him, David Delacroix. He paid me $500,000, half before, half after." "How did you first make contact with Mr. Delacroix?" "Through an encrypted messaging app. He reached out about 6 months before the hit, said he might need security services. We met in person once to discuss terms." "What did he tell you during that meeting?" "That he had a problem, an accountant who had discovered financial irregularities and was planning to report them to federal authorities. He needed the problem eliminated permanently." "Did he specifically use the word eliminated?" "No, he said he needed the situation handled so that it could never become an issue. I understood what that meant. I've been in law enforcement for 22 years. I know how criminals talk when they want plausible deniability." "What did you understand him to mean?" "That he wanted me to kill Robert Morrison." "And did you?" "Yes, I shot him 3 times in his office. His daughter was there, hiding. I didn't know that at the time." "What happened after you killed Robert Morrison?" "I called David to confirm completion. He asked if I had recovered the evidence. I told him we'd taken the computers and files. He said good, and that the rest of my payment would be transferred within 24 hours. "Was it?" "Yes, $250,000 appeared in an offshore account I control. Untraceable. Clean." Green's cross-examination focused on Harris's credibility. "You're a convicted murderer. You're testifying to avoid a harsher sentence. Why should this jury believe anything you say?" Harris met Green's eyes without flinching. "Because I have nothing to gain from lying. I'm already serving 25 years. The death penalty is off the table regardless of what I say here. I'm testifying because your client threw me under the bus. He promised to take care of my legal fees if I ever got caught. Instead, he tried to have me killed at that hotel. So yeah, I'm telling the truth, out of spite if nothing else." The honesty was brutal and compelling. The jury seemed to believe him. Huang rested her case after 5 weeks of testimony. The evidence filled 3 bankers' boxes: financial records, surveillance footage, recorded phone calls, expert opinions, eyewitness testimony. And at the center of it all, the undeniable fact that Robert Morrison had been murdered hours after filing an SEC complaint about David Delacroix's company. Green began the defense case by calling his own financial experts who tried to suggest that the money laundering could have been conducted without David's knowledge, that CFOs often signed off on transactions they didn't fully understand, That corporate complexity created plausible deniability. The prosecution's rebuttal experts demolished these arguments with detailed analysis of David's email communications, showing he had personally directed the shell company transactions. Then Green made a decision that surprised everyone. He called James Delacroix as a defense witness. James had been released from federal custody pending his own sentencing. He walked into the courtroom in a suit that no longer fit quite right, having lost weight during months of stress and legal proceedings. He took the stand and swore to tell the truth. Then he looked at his younger brother with an expression Katherine couldn't quite read. Green approached carefully. "Mr. Delacroix, you were CEO of Delacroix Capital Management for how many years?" 9 years. "And during that time, who had direct oversight of financial operations?" "My brother David. He was chief financial officer. I trusted him to manage the subsidiary accounts and corporate finances while I focused on investor relations and acquisitions." "Did you know about the money laundering scheme?" "No, David handled those operations independently. He provided me with summary reports that didn't include details about specific transactions." "So it's possible that David acted without your knowledge?" "It's not just possible, it's what happened." Katherine watched this testimony from the gallery, anger building in her chest. James Delacroix was trying to save his brother by claiming ignorance, playing the victim, suggesting that David had operated a criminal conspiracy right under his nose without any CEO oversight. Rebecca Huang's cross-examination destroyed that narrative. "Mr. Delacroix, you signed the annual financial statements for Delacroix Capital, correct?" "Yes." "Those statements included consolidated reports from all subsidiary accounts." "Yes." "Did you read them before signing?" "I reviewed the summary sections." "But not the detailed transaction records?" "No, that would have taken hundreds of hours. I relied on David to ensure accuracy." "So you signed legal documents attesting to their accuracy without actually verifying that accuracy?" "I trusted my brother." "And that trust, combined with your negligence, enabled a criminal conspiracy that resulted in murder. Isn't that correct?" James's composure cracked. "I didn't know. I didn't order anyone killed. David did that." "But you created the environment where it could happen. You built a company with no oversight, no accountability, no checks on your brother's authority. You prioritized profits over due diligence. And Robert Morrison died because of those choices." James had no answer. He looked at Katherine, his expression carrying something that might have been remorse or might have been performance. "I'm sorry. For your father. For everything." "Sorry doesn't resurrect the dead," Katherine whispered to herself. But at least he was admitting responsibility. The defense rested after 2 weeks. Closing arguments began on a Friday morning 6 weeks after the trial started. Rebecca Huang stood before the jury one final time. She had spent 6 weeks building this case brick by brick. Now she would ask 12 strangers to conclude that a Harvard-educated businessman deserved to die in prison. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard 6 weeks of testimony, hundreds of exhibits, dozens of witnesses. All of it points to one inescapable conclusion. David Delacroix ordered the murder of Robert Morrison to protect a criminal conspiracy worth tens of millions of dollars." She walked them through the evidence methodically. The shell companies, the offshore accounts, the intercepted phone calls, Harris's testimony, Katherine's photographic memory of that night, the timeline showing Robert Morrison filed his SEC complaint and was dead 42 minutes later. The defense wants you to believe this is all circumstantial, that David Delacroix is a scapegoat for his brother's crimes, but the evidence doesn't support that theory. David personally directed the transactions. David communicated with Harris. David paid for the murder. And David tried to kill his own brother when James got too close to discovering the truth. She paused, making eye contact with each juror. Robert Morrison was 45 years old. He had a daughter he loved, a career he had built through honest work, a belief that the system would protect people who told the truth. David Delacroix took all of that away because $31 million mattered more than a human life. Your job is simple. Look at the evidence, apply the law, and hold David Delacroix accountable for his crimes. Thank you. Jonathan Green stood for the defense's closing argument. He knew he was fighting against overwhelming evidence, but he had one strategy left: create reasonable doubt about David's intent. Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution wants you to believe that my client woke up one day and decided to become a murderer. A man with no history of violence, no criminal record, no pattern of behavior suggesting he was capable of ordering an execution. They want you to ignore the simpler explanation: that David was following his brother's orders. That James, the CEO, controlled the company and made the decisions that led to Robert Morrison's death. He pointed at the empty seat where James had testified. James Delacroix cut a deal with prosecutors. He gets 4 years in minimum security in exchange for blaming his younger brother. Think about that. The person with ultimate authority over the company gets a slap on the wrist while David faces life in prison. Green walked back to the defense table. Is that justice? Or is that the government picking a convenient scapegoat because they couldn't prove their case against the real criminal? The jury deliberated for 4 days. Katherine waited in a conference room at the U.S. Attorney's office, supposedly studying for her accounting exams, but really just staring at textbooks without absorbing anything. Rebecca Huang checked in periodically with updates that amounted to no news yet. On the 4th day, the call came. Jury has reached a verdict. Katherine and Huang walked to the courthouse together through winter rain that turned Manhattan's streets into rivers of gray water. The courtroom filled quickly. Journalists, legal observers. Katherine took her seat in the front row of the gallery, directly behind the prosecution table. David Delacroix sat at the defense table with Jonathan Green, his expression unreadable. The jury filed in. None of them looked at the defendant. Katherine had read enough trial coverage to know that was usually a guilty verdict sign, but she didn't let herself hope. Has the jury reached a verdict? The judge asked. We have, Your Honor. The forewoman stood, holding a piece of paper that would define whether 9 years of Katherine's life had meant anything. Count 1, murder for hire of Robert Morrison. How do you find? We find the defendant, David Delacroix, guilty. Katherine felt something break loose in her chest. Relief, vindication, the terrible satisfaction of watching her father's killer face consequences. Count 2, conspiracy to commit murder. How do you find? Guilty. The forewoman continued through all 24 counts. Money laundering, wire fraud, racketeering, guilty, guilty, guilty on every single charge. David Delacroix showed no emotion. He sat perfectly still while the judge polled each juror individually, confirming their verdict. Then the marshals approached to take him into custody pending sentencing. As he stood, David looked directly at Katherine. His expression carried hatred, rage, the impotent fury of a man who had believed his wealth would protect him and learned too late that justice sometimes functioned despite the system's corruption. Katherine met his eyes and didn't look away. She had spent 8 years hiding from this man's power. She would never hide again. Raymond Harris's trial happened separately, a formality since he had already pleaded guilty. But Katherine attended anyway, wanting to watch both men who had destroyed her family face judgment. Harris's sentencing hearing was brief. The judge acknowledged his cooperation with prosecutors, but noted that such cooperation couldn't erase the murder he had committed. 25 years in federal prison with eligibility for parole after 20. Harris would be 83 years old if he ever walked free again. He's unlikely to survive that long, Rebecca, Huang told Katherine after the hearing. Prison is hard on former cops, even in protective custody. Katherine felt nothing. Harris had pulled the trigger, but he was a weapon someone else had aimed. The real criminal was David Delacroix. 3 months later, David's sentencing hearing filled the same courtroom where the trial had concluded. Katherine had prepared a victim impact statement, working with Huang to articulate 9 years of loss in 3 minutes of testimony. She stood at the podium facing Judge Martha Reynolds, a federal judge with 30 years on the bench and a reputation for harsh sentences in corporate crime cases. Your Honor, my name is Katherine Morrison. David Delacroix ordered the murder of my father because my father discovered his crimes and chose to report them. My father believed that the system would protect people who told the truth. He was wrong. The SEC buried his complaint. The NYPD closed his case without finding his killers. And I spent 8 years hiding under a false identity because the people who murdered my father were powerful enough to make witnesses disappear. She paused, making sure her voice stayed steady. David Delacroix sits here today not because the system worked, but because I forced it to work. Because I spent 8 years investigating, gathering evidence, waiting for the chance to expose his crimes. The prosecution recommends life in prison. I ask the court to impose the maximum sentence on every count. Send a message that corporate executives can't murder their way out of accountability. David's attorney argued for leniency, cited his lack of prior criminal record, suggested that a sentence of 20 years would adequately serve justice. Judge Reynolds listened without expression. When both sides had finished, the judge spoke. Mr. Delacroix, I have presided over criminal trials for 3 decades. I have sentenced murderers, terrorists, and some of the most dangerous people this country has produced. But I have rarely encountered someone as calculating and remorseless as you. You ordered the execution of a man whose only crime was doing his civic duty. You built a criminal enterprise that laundered tens of millions of dollars. And when federal investigators closed in, you planned to murder your own brother to protect yourself. You represent everything that is wrong with a system that allows wealth to insulate people from consequences. The sentence is life in prison without possibility of parole on count 1. 840 years consecutive on the remaining counts. You will die in federal custody. Court is adjourned. Katherine watched the marshals lead David Delacroix away. He didn't look back, didn't offer any final words, just disappeared through the door that would lead to decades in a cell. It's over, Rebecca Huang said quietly. You did it. Your father's killer will never walk free. Katherine nodded but felt empty rather than satisfied. Justice had been served, but justice couldn't resurrect the dead. Her father was still gone. 9 years of her life were still lost to hiding and fighting and waiting for this moment. The system had eventually worked, but only because she had forced it to. She thought about going to visit her father's grave again, but she had been there twice already, once after the arrest, once before the trial. Another visit felt like it would be repeating herself. Instead, she went back to Chicago and threw herself into her studies at Northwestern. 3 years after the trial, Katherine Morrison graduated with her master's degree in forensic accounting. She had job offers from the FBI, the SEC, and 2 of the Big 4 accounting firms. She accepted a teaching position at Northwestern instead, assistant professor of forensic accounting, $78,000 salary, office with a view of Lake Michigan. She taught students how to read financial statements for fraud indicators, how to spot shell companies, how to trace money through offshore accounts, how to recognize patterns that others missed. And every semester, she told them about Robert Morrison. On the first day of class, she would write his name on the whiteboard. Robert Morrison, CPA, murdered for telling the truth about $31 million. Some of you will graduate and work for corporations, she would tell her students. You'll be asked to sign off on financial statements you haven't fully reviewed, to trust executives who tell you everything is fine, to prioritize profits over due diligence. And one day, you might discover evidence of fraud. When that day comes, you'll have a choice. Stay silent and keep your job, or speak up and risk everything. She would pause, making eye contact with each student. My father chose to speak up. It cost him his life. But his death exposed a criminal conspiracy and sent multiple people to prison. I'm here to teach you that whistleblowing matters. That one honest accountant can change the world. Most students listened with vague interest. But every semester, one or two would approach her after class with questions that suggested they understood, that they had seen corruption in internships or family businesses, that they wanted to know how to fight it without ending up like Robert Morrison. Katherine would spend hours with those students, teaching them the techniques her father had used, how to document evidence, how to make multiple copies and store them in different locations, how to file anonymous complaints, how to protect themselves while exposing criminals. She was training the next generation of forensic accountants to be smarter than her father had been, to survive the system's failures instead of becoming victims of them. 5 years after David's sentencing, Katherine received a letter from federal prison. The return address showed United States Penitentiary Coleman in Florida. Inmate number 47,829,019, David Delacroix. She almost threw it away without reading, but curiosity won. The letter was handwritten, the penmanship precise despite the constraints of institutional life. Katherine Morrison, you destroyed everything I built, my company, my reputation, my freedom. I hope you understand what you've done. I hope the guilt keeps you awake at night the way these concrete walls keep me awake. You turned me into a monster to satisfy your need for revenge. But we both know the truth. Your father was a fool who should have kept his mouth shut. And you're a fool for thinking justice matters more than survival. Katherine read the letter twice, then filed it in a folder she kept for correspondence she would never answer. David Delacroix wanted her to feel guilt, to question whether destroying his life had been worth it, to validate his narrative that he was the victim rather than the murderer. She felt nothing except a cold certainty that her father's killer deserved every minute of his life sentence. 7 years after David's sentencing, in the spring of 2032, Raymond Harris died in federal custody. Heart attack at age 65, 7 years into his 25-year sentence. No foul play suspected, just the natural consequence of age and stress and years in prison. Katherine received notification as a victim on record. She felt nothing. Harris had been a tool, a weapon aimed by someone else. His death didn't bring her father back or undo the trauma of watching him die. It was just another name crossed off a list. 10 years after her father's death, Katherine Morrison married a history professor at Northwestern named Michael Chen. No relation to the detective who had failed to solve her father's case, but the name had given her pause when they first met. Michael was kind, patient, understanding about her trauma without making it the defining feature of their relationship. The wedding was small, 20 people in a restaurant overlooking Lake Michigan. Katherine wore a simple dress and thought about how her father should have been there to walk her down the aisle. James Delacroix, who had been released from federal prison after serving his 4-year sentence, sent flowers with a note that read congratulations. Your father would be proud. Katherine appreciated the gesture even if it couldn't change history. She was 28 years old. She had built a career, found love, created a life that wasn't defined solely by tragedy, even though tragedy had shaped it. Her father would have wanted that, would have wanted her to survive and thrive instead of being consumed by grief and anger. Katherine Morrison Chen was learning, slowly, that honoring the dead meant living well, meant using the lessons they taught to build something meaningful, meant making sure their deaths weren't the end of their influence on the world. Her father had believed that truth mattered, that corruption should be exposed, that one person with courage could make a difference. Katherine would spend the rest of her life proving he was right. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October 2028, when Katherine Morrison Chen was grading midterm exams in her office at Northwestern University. The return address showed United States Penitentiary Coleman in Florida. Inmate number 47829-019. David Delacroix. Katherine held the envelope without opening it. 3 years had passed since the trial. 3 years since she had watched federal marshals lead David away to spend the rest of his life behind concrete walls and razor wire. 3 years of building a career, raising a daughter, teaching students how to catch financial criminals before they killed anyone. 3 years of trying to move forward, while the past remained preserved in her photographic memory with the same clarity as the day her father died. She opened the envelope. The letter inside was handwritten on prison stationery, the penmanship precise despite the constraints of institutional life. Katherine Morrison, you destroyed everything I built, my company, my reputation, my freedom. I hope you understand what you've done. I hope the guilt keeps you awake at night the way these concrete walls keep me awake. You turned me into a monster to satisfy your need for revenge, but we both know the truth. Your father was a fool who should have kept his mouth shut, and you're a fool for thinking justice matters more than survival. Katherine read the letter twice, then filed it in the bottom drawer of her desk alongside other correspondence she would never answer. David Delacroix wanted her to feel guilt, to question whether destroying his life had been worth it, to validate his narrative that he was the victim rather than the murderer. She felt nothing except a cold certainty that her father's killer deserved every minute of his life sentence. But the letter bothered her anyway, not because of its content, but because it reminded her that justice, even when served, didn't erase the damage criminals left behind. David was in prison. Raymond Harris was dead. James Delacroix had served his time and been released. The legal system had functioned. But Katherine's father was still dead. 8 years of her life were still lost to hiding. And the institutional failures that had enabled the murders, the corrupt SEC officials who had buried her father's complaint, the systemic vulnerabilities that allowed corporate executives to commit crimes with near impunity, those remained largely unchanged. She had won her case, but she hadn't fixed the system that had failed her father. That realization crystallized over the following weeks. Katherine found herself thinking more about prevention than prosecution, about how to build safeguards that would protect the next Robert Morrison instead of avenging him after his murder, about using her platform as a professor to influence policy rather than just training individual accountants. She began writing, not the academic papers that tenure required, but something more ambitious. A book that would examine corporate accountability failures through the lens of her father's case. That would propose systemic reforms to protect whistleblowers. That would force business schools and law schools and policymakers to confront how broken the system had become. The working title was The Ledger Never Lies: How Corporate Crime Killed My Father and What We Must Do to Prevent the Next Murder. The publisher was interested. The advance was substantial, but the real motivation was legacy. Katherine wanted to make sure that when people searched for her father's name, they didn't just find a cold case file from 2016. They found a movement for change that had been born from his death. She worked on the manuscript for 18 months, writing during early mornings before her daughter Emma woke up, editing late at night after Michael went to bed, interviewing other whistleblowers who had faced retaliation, consulting with FBI agents about gaps in enforcement, analyzing financial regulations that created loopholes criminals exploited. The book became her obsession in a way the trial had never quite been. The trial was about punishment. The book was about prevention. And prevention felt like the more meaningful tribute to her father's memory. The book was published in the spring of 2030, when Katherine was 31 years old and Emma was 5. The initial print run was modest, 5,000 copies. The publisher wasn't expecting bestseller numbers from an academic work about financial crime and whistleblower protection. But something unexpected happened. The book resonated. Reviews appeared in major newspapers. The Wall Street Journal called it a devastating indictment of corporate governance failures. The New York Times featured it on their business bestseller list. NPR interviewed Katherine for a 20-minute segment about her father's murder and the systemic reforms she was proposing. Within 3 months, the book had sold 40,000 copies. Congressional staffers were reading it and incorporating its recommendations into proposed legislation. Business schools were assigning it in ethics courses, and whistleblowers across the country were citing it when they filed complaints about corporate fraud. Katherine Morrison had become more than a victim who had achieved justice. She had become an advocate who was changing the system. The media attention brought unexpected complications. Journalists wanted interviews. Documentary filmmakers wanted to tell her story. Corporate defense attorneys wrote op-eds attacking her proposals as anti-business regulation that would stifle innovation. And victims of other corporate crimes reached out seeking advice, support, someone who understood what it meant to watch the system fail people you loved. Katherine tried to respond to as many as she could, but the volume was overwhelming. She started receiving 50 emails a day from people who had discovered fraud at their companies and wanted to know how to report it safely. From family members of whistleblowers who had faced retaliation. From prosecutors building cases against corporate executives who needed expert testimony. She hired a research assistant to help manage the correspondence. A graduate student named Jennifer Park, who had taken Katherine's forensic accounting seminar and written her thesis on detecting shell company fraud. Together, they began compiling resources for whistleblowers, legal referrals, best practices for documenting evidence, strategies for protecting yourself when exposing corporate crime. The work expanded beyond what one professor and one graduate assistant could handle. Katherine approached Northwestern's law school about creating a formal clinic, the Whistleblower Protection Clinic, free legal services for employees who discovered corporate fraud and needed help navigating the reporting process safely. The law school agreed, allocated funding, hired 2 attorneys to run the clinic full-time, and within a year they were handling 30 active cases. Employees who had discovered accounting fraud, securities violations, environmental crimes, workplace safety violations. People who wanted to do the right thing but feared retaliation from powerful employers. Katherine served as the clinic's faculty advisor and senior consultant on financial crimes. She taught the attorneys how to analyze corporate financial statements, how to identify money laundering patterns, how to build evidence that would survive defense attorney challenges. All the skills her father had mastered and that had gotten him killed. But this time, the people using those skills had legal protection. Federal whistleblower laws had been strengthened in the years since her father's death. Retaliation against whistleblowers now carried significant penalties. The SEC had created a rewards program that paid whistleblowers a percentage of recovered funds. And corporate executives faced personal liability for retaliating against employees who reported fraud. The system was improving, slowly, imperfectly, but measurably. Katherine marked the progress in small victories. A pharmaceutical executive convicted of securities fraud based on evidence provided by a whistleblower the clinic had protected. A defense contractor forced to pay $15 million in penalties after an employee reported billing fraud. A financial services firm whose CEO was indicted for money laundering that an accountant had documented and the clinic had helped report safely. None of these victories brought her father back, but they prevented other fathers from dying, and that felt like enough. On the 12th anniversary of her father's death in March 2028, Katherine visited his grave with her husband Michael and their daughter Emma, who was 3 years old and didn't understand why they were putting flowers on a stone in a Brooklyn cemetery. Katherine knelt beside the headstone and let Emma place the bouquet against the granite. "This is your grandfather," Katherine told her daughter. "His name was Robert Morrison. He was an accountant who told the truth about bad people doing bad things. He died because he was brave." Emma looked at the stone with the solemn curiosity of a child encountering death for the first time. "Is he sleeping?" "Something like that." Katherine brushed dirt from the letters of her father's name. "He can't be here with us, but we remember him. We tell people about what he did. We make sure his bravery mattered." Michael put a hand on Katherine's shoulder, a gesture of support that acknowledged the grief she carried without trying to minimize it. They had been married for 4 years. He understood that some wounds never fully healed, that the best you could hope for was learning to live around the scar tissue. After Emma grew bored and wandered off to explore the cemetery with Michael following at a protective distance, Katherine remained kneeling beside the grave. She did this every year. Gave herself permission to feel the full weight of her father's absence without the armor of professional accomplishment or advocacy work or the daily demands of teaching and parenting. "I published the book," she told the stone. "It's doing what I hoped. Changing minds, changing laws. The Whistleblower Protection Clinic has helped 40 people report fraud without getting fired or killed. 40 people who might have stayed silent if they didn't have support." She paused, listening to wind move through the cemetery trees. "I know that doesn't bring you back. I know it doesn't undo what David Delacroix did. But I think you'd be proud. I think you'd say I'm using your death to prevent other deaths. And that's what you would have wanted." A crow landed on a nearby headstone and watched her with black eyes that reflected nothing. Katherine stood, brushed grass from her knees, and walked back to where her husband and daughter were examining spring flowers beginning to bloom. Life continued. Memory persisted. And the work of turning tragedy into meaning never really ended. The following year brought an unexpected development. Congress passed the Corporate Accountability and Whistleblower Protection Act in 2029, legislation that had been directly influenced by Katherine's book. The act strengthened penalties for executives who retaliated against whistleblowers, created a federal task force to investigate corporate crimes more aggressively, and established a victims' compensation fund for families of whistleblowers who faced violence. Katherine was invited to the White House for the signing ceremony. She stood in the East Room surrounded by other whistleblowers and their families, watching the president sign legislation that might have saved her father's life if it had existed in 2016. The pen the president used was given to her afterward, mounted on a plaque that read in recognition of Katherine Morrison, Chen's advocacy for whistleblower protection. She kept the pen on her desk at Northwestern, a reminder that systems could change when enough people demanded it. That one person's death could catalyze reforms that protected thousands. That her father's murder had meant something beyond personal tragedy. But she also kept David Delacroix's letter in her desk drawer, a reminder that criminals rarely saw themselves as guilty. That wealth and education didn't prevent moral bankruptcy. That some people would always choose profit over principle, would always prioritize their own interests over human life, and that eternal vigilance was the only defense against their depredations. Katherine taught these lessons to her students. Every semester, she would begin her advanced forensic accounting course the same way, writing 2 names on the whiteboard: Robert Morrison, David Delacroix. One was an honest accountant who died for exposing corporate fraud, she would tell her class. The other is serving life in prison for ordering that murder. Your job as forensic accountants is to make sure there are more Robert Morrisons and fewer David Delacroix in the world. You do that by being competent, being ethical, and being brave when the situation demands it. Most students listened with the polite attention of people who planned comfortable careers at Big Four firms. But every semester, a few would approach her after class with questions that suggested they understood the stakes, that they had seen corruption in their internships or family businesses, that they wanted to be the kind of accountant who prevented crimes rather than just auditing them after the fact. Katherine would spend hours with those students, teaching them the specific skills her father had used: how to document evidence without alerting the people being investigated, how to identify money laundering patterns in routine transactions, how to build a case that would survive scrutiny from defense attorneys and corporate lawyers. She was creating an army of forensic accountants trained to catch David Delacroix before they killed Robert Morrisons. And over the years, her students began achieving exactly that. A former student named Marcus Webb joined the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit and led the investigation that convicted a hedge fund manager of securities fraud worth $200 million. Another student, Sarah Kim, went to work for the SEC and helped prosecute insider trading cases that recovered funds for defrauded investors. A third student, James Rodriguez, became a corporate compliance officer who implemented fraud detection systems that prevented crimes rather than just documenting them after they happened. Katherine tracked their careers with the pride of a teacher watching students exceed expectations. Each prosecution, each prevention, each time the system worked the way it was supposed to. Those were victories that honored her father's memory more than any trial verdict could. But the work was never finished. Corporate crime evolved faster than regulations could adapt. Criminals found new loopholes, new ways to hide money, new technologies that created opportunities for fraud, cryptocurrency, offshore banking havens that refused cooperation with U.S. investigators, shell companies registered in jurisdictions that prioritized secrecy over accountability. The fight was perpetual, and Katherine had committed her professional life to waging it. She was promoted to associate professor with tenure in her 10th year at Northwestern in 2034. The promotion came with a named chair, the Robert Morrison Professorship in Forensic Accounting, funded by a portion of the proceeds from her book and supplemented by donations from whistleblowers who had been inspired by her advocacy. The title meant something beyond academic prestige. It meant her father's name would appear in university directories and on her office door and in publications for as long as the endowment existed. It meant students would ask about Robert Morrison and learn his story. It meant his death had created something permanent rather than just fading into the archives of cold cases and forgotten tragedies. Katherine accepted the professorship at a small ceremony attended by colleagues, students, and her family. In her acceptance speech, she talked about her father, about his belief that numbers didn't lie even when people did, about his decision to report corporate fraud despite the risks, about how his murder had changed her life and launched her career and shaped everything she had accomplished. "My father was 45 years old when he died," she said. "He had so much left to give, so many more frauds to detect, so many more clients to serve honestly. David Delacroix stole all of that potential, but he couldn't kill what my father believed in, and he couldn't prevent me from carrying forward my father's work. This professorship ensures that Robert Morrison's legacy will continue teaching students long after I'm gone. That's a kind of immortality. That's justice that extends beyond courtrooms and prison sentences. Thank you. The audience applauded. Michael and Emma, now 9 years old, sat in the front row, pride evident on their faces. And Katherine felt, for the first time since her father's death, something approaching peace. Not the absence of grief, but the integration of loss into a life that had meaning despite tragedy. That peace was tested 6 months later, when she received notification that James Delacroix had been released from federal prison after serving 4 years of his sentence. He had been a model prisoner, participated in rehabilitation programs, taught business ethics classes to other inmates, written a memoir about corporate negligence that was being published by a small press. Katherine's first reaction was anger. 4 years for enabling murder seemed obscenely inadequate. David was serving life. Raymond Harris had died in custody. But James, whose negligence had created the environment where her father could be killed, was walking free after less time than she had spent in hiding. But her second reaction was more complicated. James had cooperated fully with prosecutors, had testified against his brother, had forfeited his entire fortune to victims of the fraud scheme, had dedicated himself to teaching other executives to avoid the mistakes he had made. He had paid a price, even if that price seemed insufficient compared to the crime. And he had been reaching out to Katherine for years, sending letters expressing remorse, offering to meet if she ever wanted to talk, proposing to donate to the Whistleblower Protection Clinic or fund scholarships in her father's name. Gestures that might have been genuine atonement or might have been image rehabilitation. Katherine hadn't responded to any of them. But now that he was released, the question became more pressing. Would she agree to meet with him? Would she give him the absolution he seemed to be seeking? Would she allow him to participate in the legacy she had built from her father's death? She discussed it with Michael, with her therapist, with Rebecca Huang, who had prosecuted the case and maintained occasional contact over the years. The consensus was that she should do whatever felt right for her own healing, that she owed James Delacroix nothing. That meeting with him or refusing to meet with him were both valid choices. Katherine thought about it for 3 weeks. Then she sent a brief email to the address James had provided in his most recent letter. "I'll meet with you once. 1 hour, public place. Don't expect forgiveness." They met at a coffee shop in Chicago on a Saturday morning in March 2035, 19 years after Robert Morrison's murder. James Delacroix arrived 10 minutes early, looking older than his 54 years. Prison had aged him in ways wealth and privilege had previously prevented. Gray hair, deep lines around his eyes, a weariness that suggested he carried burdens heavier than the physical restrictions of incarceration. He stood when Katherine entered. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. I wasn't sure you would." Katherine sat across from him without ordering coffee. She didn't plan to stay long enough to drink it. "You said in your letters that you wanted to make amends. I'm here to tell you that's not possible. My father is dead. No amount of remorse changes that." James nodded slowly. "I know, but I needed you to hear me say it in person. I'm sorry, for your father, for my negligence, for trusting my brother without verifying his work, for building a company culture that prioritized profits over accountability. I'm sorry." The words hung between them. Katherine studied his face, her photographic memory comparing it to how he had looked during the trial. The changes were significant. This wasn't the confident CEO who had sat in the courtroom watching his empire collapse. This was a man who had been broken by consequences and was trying to reassemble himself into something less destructive. "Why did you want to meet?" Katherine asked. "What do you actually want from me?" "I want to know if there's anything I can do, any way I can contribute to the work you're doing. The clinic, the advocacy, the legislative reforms. I have expertise in corporate governance. I understand how these systems fail from the inside. If you could use that knowledge, I'd like to help." Katherine hadn't expected this. She had assumed James wanted absolution, forgiveness, some statement from her that would allow him to feel less guilty about his role in her father's death. But he was offering to work, to contribute, to turn his expertise into prevention. The clinic could use someone who understands corporate culture from an executive perspective, she said slowly. Someone who can teach our clients how to navigate internal reporting structures without getting fired or retaliated against. But I need to be clear. This wouldn't be about your redemption. It would be about using your experience to protect whistleblowers. Can you accept that? James met her eyes. Yes, I don't expect redemption. I just want to do something useful with the rest of my life. Something that honors what your father tried to do. They talked for another 40 minutes. Katherine laid out the clinic's needs. James described the governance failures he had witnessed and participated in. They discussed potential curriculum for training corporate compliance officers. Resources for employees who discovered fraud but feared reporting it would end their careers. Systemic reforms that would make it harder for executives to claim ignorance when their subordinates committed crimes. By the end of the conversation, they had outlined a consulting arrangement. James would volunteer 20 hours a month to the clinic. He would teach workshops on corporate accountability. He would review cases and provide strategic advice on navigating internal reporting systems. He would use his experience as a cautionary tale rather than trying to rehabilitate his image. And he would do it all without compensation, without credit, without any attempt to profit from his connection to Robert Morrison's case. Katherine didn't forgive him, didn't tell him his contribution would erase his guilt. But she accepted his offer because the clinic needed his expertise and because turning his failures into prevention felt like a more productive use of his remorse than letting him wallow in guilt while doing nothing useful. Over the following years, James became an unlikely but effective asset to the whistleblower protection work. He taught executives how to build cultures that encouraged, rather than punished, ethical reporting. He consulted on cases where employees had discovered fraud and needed advice on navigating corporate hierarchies. He testified before congressional committees about governance failures that enabled white-collar crime. And he never asked Katherine for forgiveness, never tried to claim he had redeemed himself, just worked quietly in the background, using his knowledge to prevent other Robert Morrisons from dying. It wasn't justice, but it was useful, and Katherine had learned that usefulness was sometimes the best you could extract from tragedy. 20 years after her father's death, in March 2036, Katherine Morrison Chen stood in front of 500 people at a conference on corporate accountability in Washington, D.C. She was 37 years old, an associate professor with a growing national reputation as one of the country's leading experts on forensic accounting and whistleblower protection. The conference was organized by a coalition of ethics organizations, law schools, and government agencies. The theme was protecting those who protect us. 3 days of panels and workshops on whistleblower protection, corporate governance reform, and prosecuting white-collar crime. Katherine was the keynote speaker for the final session. Her daughter Emma, now 11 years old, sat in the front row beside Michael. Emma had heard her mother speak before, but this was the first time she would hear the full story of her grandfather's death and what it had meant. Katherine stood at the podium looking out at an audience that included current and former whistleblowers, FBI agents, prosecutors, corporate compliance officers, journalists who covered financial crime, and students studying forensic accounting. People who had dedicated their careers to the same work that had killed her father. 20 years ago today, she began, my father Robert Morrison was murdered in his Brooklyn accounting office. He was shot 3 times by a hired killer on orders from a corporate executive whose crimes my father had discovered and reported. I was 17 years old. I watched him die. And for the next 8 years, I lived under a false identity because the people who killed my father had the power to make witnesses disappear." She paused, letting the audience absorb this. The system failed my father in every possible way. The SEC buried his whistleblower complaint. The police closed his murder case without finding his killers. The corporate executives who had enabled the fraud faced no consequences until 8 years later, when I forced the system to work by gathering evidence and cooperating with federal investigators who finally took the case seriously. Katherine clicked to the next slide, a photograph of Robert Morrison in his office, taken a month before his death. Smiling, confident, alive. My father believed that the system would protect people who told the truth. He was wrong, but his death taught me something important. The system doesn't protect whistleblowers automatically. It protects them only when enough people fight to make it work. When prosecutors are willing to build difficult cases. When FBI agents are willing to pursue investigations that powerful people want buried. When legislators are willing to pass laws that corporations oppose. When ordinary citizens are willing to demand accountability, even when it's expensive and complicated, and takes years to achieve. She clicked again, images of legislation being signed, of FBI agents making arrests, of corporate executives in handcuffs, of whistleblowers receiving awards for exposing fraud. In the 20 years since my father died, we've made progress. The Corporate Accountability and Whistleblower Protection Act has protected hundreds of employees who reported fraud. The Whistleblower Protection Clinic at Northwestern has helped secure over $500 million in penalties against companies that violated securities laws, environmental regulations, and financial controls. My students have gone on to prosecute corporate crimes, detect fraud, and build systems that prevent rather than just punish bad behavior. Another slide, photographs of former students, success stories, convictions obtained, frauds prevented. But the work is far from finished. Corporate crime continues to evolve. Criminals find new ways to hide money, exploit loopholes, and intimidate witnesses. And every year, whistleblowers still face retaliation, still lose their jobs, still struggle to survive after doing the right thing. Some, like my father, still pay with their lives. Katherine's voice grew harder, more urgent. So I'm here today to tell you that we can't become complacent. We can't assume the system works just because it worked in my father's case eventually, imperfectly, after 8 years and millions in investigation costs. We have to keep fighting, keep demanding accountability, keep protecting the people who expose corruption. Because the alternative is accepting that criminals win, whistleblowers die, and justice is only for those who can afford expensive lawyers. The audience was silent, attentive. Katherine could see faces in the crowd, former whistleblowers who had faced retaliation, FBI agents who had worked on corporate crime cases, students who were deciding whether to pursue careers in forensic accounting, all of them united by a belief that the system could work if enough people forced it to. My father died believing that truth mattered more than safety, Katherine concluded, that exposing corruption was worth the risk, that one honest accountant could make a difference. I've spent 20 years proving he was right, that his death meant something, that his courage inspired changes that have protected countless others. But this work doesn't end with me. It continues with you. Every prosecutor who takes on difficult cases, every agent who investigates powerful criminals, every student who chooses ethics over profit, every whistleblower who speaks up despite the risks. You are Robert Morrison's legacy. You are the proof that his death wasn't in vain. Thank you. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. Katherine stood at the podium accepting applause that felt simultaneously earned and insufficient. No amount of advocacy could resurrect her father. No amount of systemic reform could undo his murder. But this work, this community of people dedicated to protecting whistleblowers and prosecuting corporate crime, this was something. This was meaning extracted from tragedy. After the conference, Katherine flew back to Chicago with her family. Emma fell asleep on the plane, her head resting against Katherine's shoulder. Michael held Katherine's hand, offering silent support for the emotional weight of the day. The next morning, Katherine drove alone to the cemetery in Brooklyn where her father was buried. She hadn't visited on the actual anniversary because of the conference schedule, but she came now, carrying flowers and the weight of 20 years of memory. The headstone had been updated since her last visit. Someone, probably James Delacroix, had funded an addition. Below Robert Morrison's name and dates, new words had been carved into the granite. His courage inspired a movement. His death changed the law. His legacy protects those who tell the truth. Katherine knelt and placed flowers against the stone. She was crying without quite knowing why. Relief, maybe, or exhaustion, or the simple accumulation of 2 decades of grief that never fully went away, but learned to coexist with joy and purpose and the ordinary pleasures of a life well lived. "We did it, Dad," she whispered. "We changed the system. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough that the next person who discovers corporate fraud has better protection than you did. Enough that your death saved lives. That's what you would have wanted." The cemetery was quiet except for wind in the trees and distant traffic. Katherine stayed for an hour, sitting beside her father's grave, remembering the man who had taught her that numbers didn't lie, and that integrity mattered more than wealth, and that speaking truth to power was the most important thing an accountant could do. When she finally stood to leave, she noticed something she had never seen before. Other people had left flowers at her father's grave, not fresh ones, old bouquets in various stages of decay. Evidence that Robert Morrison's story had reached beyond his immediate family. That strangers had been moved to honor a man they had never met but whose courage had inspired them. Katherine didn't know who had left the flowers. Former whistleblowers, maybe, or students who had read her book, or people who had been protected by the laws that her father's death had helped create. But whoever they were, they had understood something essential. That ordinary people who did extraordinary things deserved to be remembered. That martyrdom, while tragic, could catalyze change. That death, while final, didn't have to be meaningless. She walked back to her car feeling something she hadn't felt in 20 years. Not peace, exactly, but acceptance. Her father was gone. That reality would never change. But his life had mattered. His death had mattered. And the work she had built from his murder had protected hundreds of people who might otherwise have been silenced, fired, or killed for exposing corporate crime. That was legacy. That was justice that extended beyond courtrooms and conviction rates. That was meaning. Katherine Morrison, Chen drove home to her husband and daughter and the comfortable life she had built despite tragedy. She would continue teaching, continue advocating, continue training the next generation of forensic accountants to be brave and competent and ethical. Continue fighting against a system that still protected wealth over truth, but was slowly, measurably improving. And every year on March 14th, she would return to that cemetery in Brooklyn, would tell her father about the cases won, the laws passed, the whistleblowers protected, would place flowers on a grave that had become a monument not just to one man's death, but to a movement he had accidentally founded by dying for what he believed in. The numbers never lied. People did, but people could also tell the truth. And when they did, when they risked everything to expose corruption, the world could change. One whistleblower at a time, one prosecution at a time, one student at a time, one law at a time. Robert Morrison had believed that. He had died for it, and his daughter had spent 2 decades making sure his belief became reality. That was enough. It had to be enough. Because the alternative was accepting that speaking truth to power was suicide, that corruption always won, that justice was a fairy tale. Katherine Morrison refused to accept that. She would teach her students to refuse it too. And maybe, eventually, enough people would refuse that the system would start working on its own instead of requiring martyrs to force it. That was the world her father had wanted. That was what Katherine Morrison Chen would spend the rest of her life building. In memory of Robert Morrison. In honor of every whistleblower who had faced retaliation for doing the right thing. In hope that the next generation would inherit a system that protected truth tellers instead of punishing them. The ledger never lied. Katherine had learned that from her father. She had proved it in court. She had built a career teaching it. And she would make sure that lesson outlived her, passed down to students who would pass it to their students, creating a lineage of ethical accountants who understood that numbers were weapons against corruption, and that wielding those weapons was the most important work anyone could do. Robert Morrison's death had begun that lineage. Katherine Morrison's life had sustained it. And somewhere, in an accounting classroom or an FBI office or a corporate compliance department, the next generation was learning to carry it forward. The work was never finished, but it was meaningful. And meaning, Katherine had learned, was the best tribute you could offer to someone whose death should never have happened but whose life had inspired changes that would protect thousands. Her father would have been proud. That thought sustained her through the hard days, the setbacks, the moments when the system failed again and criminals escaped justice. Because pride from the dead was impossible. But living in a way that would have made them proud, that was achievable. That was the standard Katherine held herself to. And by that standard, she had succeeded, had honored her father's memory, had turned his murder into meaning, had built something that would outlast her and continue protecting whistleblowers long after she was gone. That was justice, imperfect, incomplete, but real. Katherine Morrison Chen would take it, would build on it, would fight for it every day for the rest of her life. Because the ledger never lied. And the truth, difficult as it was to speak and dangerous as it was to defend, remained the only weapon that mattered against those who believed their wealth and power placed them above accountability. Her father had known that, had died for it, and Katherine Morrison had made sure that his death proved he was right. That was legacy. That was love. That was the only form of resurrection available to those who mourned. And it was enough. David Delacroix remained in prison. 49 years old now, 20 years into a life sentence, his former brilliance dimmed by decades behind bars. Katherine received occasional updates from the Bureau of Prisons. He had been transferred to psychiatric observation after several incidents. The letters had stopped years ago. He existed now as nothing more than inmate number 47,829,019, his name forgotten by everyone except the people whose lives he had destroyed. That was justice, too, not the dramatic confrontation, not the tearful apology, just the slow, grinding reality of consequences that would never end. David Delacroix would die in prison. His empire was gone. His legacy was poison, and the world had moved on without him. Katherine rarely thought about him anymore. He was irrelevant to the work that mattered. Just another cautionary tale she used to teach students about the cost of choosing greed over principle. The real victory wasn't David's imprisonment. It was the 40 whistleblowers the clinic had protected. The $500 million in penalties recovered. The laws that had been changed. The students who had been trained. The system that had been pushed, inch by inch, toward actually protecting the people who told the truth. That was what Robert Morrison's death had purchased. That was what Katherine Morrison had built from the ruins of her childhood. That was what would outlive them both. 20 years after her father's murder, Katherine Morrison Chen closed the folder containing David Delacroix's last letter, locked her desk drawer, and walked out of her office at Northwestern University. Her daughter was waiting in the car with Michael. They were going to dinner to celebrate Emma's 11th birthday. Life continued. Work continued. The fight for justice continued. And somewhere in Brooklyn, a stone marked the grave of an honest accountant who had died for believing that truth mattered more than survival. He had been right. Katherine had proved it. And that was the only memorial that truly mattered. What would you do if you witnessed your father's murder, and the system buried the truth? Katherine Morrison spent 8 years hiding, then 20 years fighting to change the laws that failed him. This story isn't just about revenge. It's about whether one person can actually fix a broken system. Have you ever seen corruption at work? Did you speak up or stay silent? Drop your thoughts below. I read every comment. And if this story resonated with you, hit subscribe. Next week's story explores what happens when a surgeon discovers his hospital is killing patients for profit. You won't want to miss it.